We all want to belong. But as leaders, are we creating welcoming places where people feel they have a place? Let me do that again. Gee, I practiced it all day. Here we go. We all want to belong. But as leaders, are we creating welcoming places where people feel they have a place? Hello, I'm Chester Elton, and this is my dear friend and co-author, Adrian Gostick.
Thanks, Chess. Our guest today is going to talk about a concept called radical self-inquiry, which is a process to come home to ourselves. As always, we hope the time you spend with us will help reduce the stigma of anxiety at work and in your personal life.
And with us is our new friend, Jerry Colonna, an executive coach who uses the skills he learned as a venture capitalist to help entrepreneurs. He is a co-founder and CEO of Reboot, an executive coaching and leadership development company. He is also the host of Reboot Podcast and the author of the new book, Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong from Harper Business. Hey, we're delighted to have you here today, Jerry. Thanks so much for finding the time.
Well, it's delightful to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation, so thanks for having me.
Well, we are too, Jerry. We publish with Harper Business as well, so we were excited to see a fellow Harper alum here. And got a copy of Reunion before we began, so I've dug in a little bit, and I want you to start with the big picture. I'm going to ask a few questions here. You know, what is Reunion? What are our ancestor stories you talk about? And why do we need to belong? So give us the overall picture.
Well, I'll start with a basic supposition that really has marked my career as a coach. And it's a simple statement that's kind of obvious, and that is that better humans make better leaders. And I often joke, it's so obvious, and yet we don't have really good leadership. And why is that? And the reason is that the process of becoming a better human, and Chester, you mentioned radical self-inquiry, the process of becoming a better human is actually quite a difficult process. It means, to use the language from my first book, Reboot, it means that we have to grow up and become adults. And we're often reluctant to do that. So with that as the backdrop in the context, one of the questions I began to really grapple with is, and this was in the summer of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, was the question of what does it mean to be a better human when so many of our fellow humans lack a sense of belonging? Right? I know that you both endeavor to make the experience of being humanly anxious a little bit more normal and normalized. But what would happen if folks who define themselves and identify themselves outside of the dominant cultural norms, in our case, perhaps I identify as a white, cisgender, straight male in a world that still seems to allow more safety and security for those who identify as I do. What would it be like if I could use my efforts to be a better human to extend that sense of safety and love to those who identify differently from me? And so I see this process of reunion as a process of bringing the internal work of radical self-inquiry to the external world.
That's interesting. Well, talk about a little bit about those ancestor stories. I'm very curious about that. You know, we do often say we're the product of our, parents, our grandparents, and so on. And so I'm very curious about this ancestor story and how that plays into your coaching.
Well, one of the things that I was doing when I was researching this book was I started kind of at the beginning. And I asked the question, right, because my observation first and foremost is that we all long to belong. And if you see the experience of being human right now through that lens, it starts to help you understand conflict. It starts you to understand the ways in which we go at each other. Okay, Well, if that's a universal experience, then guess what? I have the same longing. And I started to ask myself the question, not only who am I, which was arguably the question in my first book, but whose am I? To whom do I belong? And as I began to look at that question, I began to look at the experience of our ancestors, our relationship to our ancestors. And I think many of us, especially those of us who descend from folks who emigrated from Europe to the United States, can carry a mythology about our ancestors. And the mythology goes like this: boy, were they resilient. Boy, let me tell you what they overcame. Now, like a lot of myths, it has a kernel of truth. They did overcome a lot. But what is it that we don't talk about? We don't talk about, for example, at least I did in my family, what did they leave behind? Why did they leave? And what did they experience when they came here? And to close the thought for a moment, the reason I think that that's important is that when we do the work of trying to understand the experience of those, quote, not like us, without first understanding who the heck are we, the danger is that our efforts at equity and inclusivity will land as hollow and performative.
Okay, so, it is interesting because you're right. This is why I'm such a big fan of journals, right? Mm-hmm. Write it down, right? Good and ill. Hopefully, you're not saying things you regret or nasty things. Good and ill. And this idea of your ancestry. We tell our kids, look, your grandpa and grandpa, your great-grandpa and grandpa, they did hard things. You can do hard things too. Mm-hmm. To your point, we say, look, they weren't perfect. There's lots of things that we can learn from those mistakes. Mm-hmm. And speaking of mistakes, I want to get this to the workplace, to your work in leadership, because you say that many leaders fall into the trap of toxicity, right? Mm-hmm. And so what are leaders doing that are toxic? And what can they do if they're off track to break out of that cycle? Can you dig a little deeper on that? And again, I think ancestor story here is really important because often we are the leaders that led us because we looked at them and said, well, that's what a leader does. I was sharing an experience with a friend when I left a certain role that I had. I said, the reason I left that role is I looked around to the leaders that were above me, and there was no one that I wanted to emulate. I didn't want to become, they weren't bad people. In fact, they were quite good people. The way they led their lives wasn't something that I was interested in. And so I left. So talk about leadership legacy as well as that toxicity. How do they break that cycle? I'm fascinated.
Well, there are a lot of ways in which that shows up. One is, and I'm sure you've experienced something similar in your own work, when we grow up into adulthood, either by living through mythology, living through, say, our legacy, lineage lessons that we've learned. We might learn, for example, that conflict is to be avoided at all costs. When we grow up in those environments, and then we give that person power, what ends up happening is we create the powerful person sets a cultural norm that flows throughout the entire organization. And so conflict avoidance is a great example of the kinds of toxicity that end up undermining a sense of belonging or a sense of safety for those, especially those who have less power within the organization. And so doing this work is essential to creating the organizations that we often tell ourselves we want to be a part of. It requires us to do our own internal radical self-inquiry, our own work in that regard.
And this is some work. And you're also touching on the impact that we're having on others as well. And one of the things you talk about is that we need to acknowledge that impact, some of it negative, and you say we need to go through the process of making amends with those we lead. So walk us through that, because most leaders are not usually eager to talk about their shortcomings and their failings, etc. Walk us through this.
Not many leaders like to say, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I think that's where you're getting right, Adrian.
Right. Well, isn't it interesting that you both acknowledged that and laughed? And yet, who pays the price? The people who have less power in the organization, sometimes those who are marginalized, but oftentimes it's just those throughout the organization. And so let's just pause for a moment and say, what if we had a political leader, President of the United States, for example, who turned around and said, my bad, I made a mistake, right? Adrian, you picked up on the notion of making amends. I will often make that's actually part of the three-step process. The first step is to acknowledge that a mistake has been made. The second step is to apologize for that. And the third step is to endeavor to make amends. As a Buddhist teacher once said to me, the 3 A's, right? Not only are leaders not comfortable, many of our leaders are not socialized to acknowledge what is going on. They can't even fathom making amends because it threatens a sense of status and power that may go all the way back in their lineage to, that which we fought for must be held on so tightly that you cannot release the grip on it. So that was a long-winded response to a great question.
Well, it's and Chester, I think you'd agree. It's nowadays, we don't see, you're bringing up politicians. We don't see politicians doing this because we're in a sort of gotcha culture. Somebody acknowledges, a mistake. I go back to Bill Clinton the last time I remember a president saying, okay, you caught me. And actually acknowledging something. I'm not saying one side or the other is right. I'm saying it's been a long time. And so that probably does trickle into the workplace where we want to retain power. We want to retain our status. We want to
think of yourself in the experience of being a child. Okay, our first power dynamic that we often experience is that which our parents. Now, even at 5 years old, we can have a sense of injustice. We can have a sense of right and wrong, right? And imagine being the wrong not being acknowledged by our parents. You know what that feels like in your body. How does that lend itself to suppressed anger, self-denigration, imposter syndrome, anxiety? What if we started to flip that script a little bit and made being honest, being clear, taking responsibility, adjuncts to what Brené Brown has so beautifully taught us, adjuncts to the strong quality of vulnerability. And what if we sort of put it into this new realm called honesty? What if those who had power were honest with themselves first and then later with others?
Yeah, it'd be powerful. Be very powerful.
I mean, call me crazy, but wouldn't that help?
It would.
No, you're crazy, Jerry. You told me to call you crazy, and you're in a power of authority, so I'm going to be obedient. Hey, we watched the video of yours, and you say you want us to be healthy containers. Interesting concept. But if our containers lack good spiritually based content, they are meaningless. And I was really intrigued by that because, more and more people don't identify themselves with any kind of formal spirituality, churches. And yet a lot of people do define themselves as spiritual in their own definitions. So when you talk about this being spiritually based content, define that a little more for me. And how do you bridge those divides of people that say, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I'm religious not necessarily spiritual? You get both ways, right?
Let me back into that. Oftentimes when I am presenting my work or my views of things, I get the yeah, but response.
Right.
You know the yeah, but. Oh, that all sounds well and good, but yeah, I have a company I have to run. I have stock performance I have to hit, right? And so what I often do is I'll pick up a coffee mug, as I'm doing here, and I'll say, container without content is meaningless. But content without container is useless. And so what I do with that metaphor is I say leaders can walk and chew gum at the same time. Leaders can create a profitable container of a business. They can hold the structures that are necessary to build bridges and lay roads and create meaningful progress in our societies. But to do so disconnected from the morality and ethics, oftentimes showing up in what we would say is spirituality, is hollow and ultimately meaningless. So what I try to do with that content and container metaphor is link the two and show that they're not in opposition, but they're actually in service to one another.
I love that. It's a great metaphor, Jerry. Yeah. Hey, people are going to be interested in how they can learn more about your work. Where would you send them?
The best place to find your way into my work is at the website reunion.reboot.io. Reboot is the company. It's also the name of my first book, and Reunion is the website for the new book. And what we try to do at Reboot is really bring forth these kinds of issues and make the connection between exploring these issues and becoming a better human so that you can then be that better leader that you really want to be.
So when somebody buys in, so you're presenting to somebody, you're coaching somebody, and they say, okay, you got me, Jerry. I want to fill my container with positive content. So give us some specific practices, things we should be doing as you send us off today. A couple of things we can be doing to better utilize some of these ideas from Reunion in our lives as leaders.
Well, let's go back to that first question you asked about radical self-inquiry. The process of self-inquiry, and as I point out, it's often radical because we don't do it. And so one of the first steps is to actually, and Chester, you mentioned journaling, is to actually begin the process of being honest with yourself. What am I struggling with? Why do I believe what I believe? What is actually going on for me? What is the challenge that I'm dealing with? And if we start to do that, then we open up the possibility of connecting with others. I don't care if it's a coach or a therapist or a minister or your best friend walking down the street. You get to be honest with them. And then you can imagine being honest with your employees. And then what happens is you start to create this really interesting experience where everybody gets to be honest. And then you go create magic together. Go build a company, because that's magic.
Fascinating. Hey, we're always interested in, your self-care. Mm-hmm. How do you keep yourself, the good container with the good content? Give us one or two things that you do that keeps you mentally sharp and on track and honest and vulnerable.
Well, the two practices that I've been doing for a very long time, the first is journaling. I've been journaling since I was 13 years old, and rarely do I miss a day. Usually it's because I'm sick or something like that. And the second practice, which I've been doing for now 20 years, is meditation. And I see them both as two sides of the same coin. Being honestly with my mind, no matter how crazy my mind might feel. And just that simple act of non-judgmentally being with myself creates this sort of level set ground that then allows me to go out through my day and, for the most part, manage my own anxiety so that I'm not toxically passing it along to the people around me.
Oh.
Now he's recording to his computer, so it's probably going to be okay. But
I hope so.
He's frozen for you too.
Yeah.
Hello?
Jerry, are you there?
Oh, we froze for a minute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. You're back. Yeah. Hopefully, like I say, you're recording to your computer, so I think, and you're wrapping up anyway, so I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we're good.
I'll ask you the last question, and we'll kind of close out here. So, okay. Well, Jerry, this has been such a great conversation. So, kind of as you close here, maybe give me one or two big takeaways that when you wrote Reboot and now going into Reunion, what did you learn maybe that has expanded your thinking that you'd want to share with our listeners?
Well, that's a great question because Reunion, unlike Reboot, I was documenting a process that I was going through myself. And among the many things that I learned were the truths of my ancestors, which I was unwilling to look at, even growing up. And I will say that the process of that was uncomfortable, but ultimately has made me more empathetic, which, I'll warn you, increased empathy means you often feel the suffering of the world. And that was the most important thing that I took away. You know, in the closing words of the book, in the author's note, I wrote about discovering the sense of kinship and feeling like, just like me, this person, fill in the blank. And it's a beautiful feeling, and it can be hurtful and painful at times as well.
Jerry, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for your wisdom, your research, sharing your knowledge. Our guest is Jerry Colonna. He is the CEO of Reboot and the author of the new book, Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong, from Harper Business. So visit his website, buy his book, and hopefully let's create better humans together so we can have better leaders in the workplace. Thanks so much, Jerry. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.
Well, Adrian, that was a deep dive into being human and being conscious and vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Jerry really brought up some really interesting ideas in probing ourselves and understanding our ancestry. What jumped out to you?
Well, first off, we all want to belong, and what community do we spend more time with than our work communities? And let's just be honest that sometimes we don't help people belong. And he says, look, one of the things that I've got to do, he said, as a white guy, is extend safety and love to those who identify maybe a little differently than me. And that was pretty powerful.
I like that better humans make better leaders. You know, in our coaching, we always say, I don't want to make you just a better leader. I want you to help you to be the person you want to be, you know, whether that's a better spouse, father, wife, husband, brother, neighbor. I think that was really important. The one thing that he said that kind of made me laugh is becoming a better human means we have to grow up.
Yeah, I saw that.
I'm in a generation where we never want to grow up. You know, it's I'm a Toys R Us kid, right? I don't ever want to grow up. And that was a call to action.
Yeah.
You know, grow up. And
what is it? And part of that is self-identification, right?
Right.
Or self-inquiry. Sorry, as he talked about, is digging a little deeper to see why we're not maybe changing some of the things that were part of our ancestry. You talked about it with we get a lot from our parents, from our first bosses, etc. maybe like, hey, I'm English too. We don't like conflict. So we
Right.
push that down. Right?
Interesting you'd say that. The sun never set on the British Empire, Adrian. I think the
Yeah, the
English
English
were
like
a
actually
great...
like
yeah,
have a
they did
conflict,
like
yeah.
conflict for a long time. Radical self-inquiry, that was the word that, he says, because we don't do it.
Yeah.
We don't want to do it. We don't want to find out. He said, dig deep into your ancestry and confront the good and the bad. We all carry with us those strengths, and we want to emphasize that our ancestors were tough. They did hard things. They were resilient.
Yeah.
And they also suffered from a lot of things,
And they may have had some. They may have had some biases. They may have had some prejudices that we need to talk about and not make them out to be these, just imperfect people. Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you think about the honesty kind of thought from Jerry? That look, we need to be more honest, clear, take responsibility, and in some ways this is very powerful. I remember being early in my career, and my boss had not done something that he was supposed to, and I went into the chief, the CFO's office, and I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get to that." I took responsibility for my boss who'd messed up, and the other employees who were with me kind of went afterwards, like, "Wow, thanks for," and it really became something where, "Hey, Adrian, we'll take responsibility," and it was actually a good thing that I took responsibility, even though I was. But in many cases nowadays, if we're honest, we take responsibility, we're sort of vilified. There's not a lot of
You're
second.
weak.
Yeah.
This idea of, wouldn't it be great if we had honest politicians? When has that ever happened?
Yeah. And
you can never, ever admit a mistake. I liked his 3 A's: acknowledge the mistake, apologize, and then make amends.
Yeah.
A very simple process. I love that he keeps a journal. I'm a big journaler. I don't write every day, but I'll write four or 5 times a week. And journals and meditation, good ideas to keep yourself honest. The spirituality piece, I wish we'd had a little more time to go deeper in that. He talked about spirituality as being important, and yet didn't really get into what does that really mean. Does it, obviously it can mean more than just going to church. I was curious where his spirituality came from. He talked about Buddha, and he talked about meditation, but that's as far as we went. I think that's an area that we're ever exploring as we become more human.
Yeah.
Where do we fit in the universe? What is our take on who we are, where we come from, and where we're going? Those eternal questions. Would have liked to add a little more time. Maybe we can invite him back sometime.
Yeah, no, because I think that is part of being a well-rounded person, is finding that connection to the universe. Whatever we personally believe it is, that needs to be part of who we are. And so, it was a great discussion. Some really interesting takes from Jerry on life and work and how we can become more human leaders. So big thanks to Jerry for joining us today. A special thanks to our producer, Brent Klein, who helps us get in touch with the universe in more ways than one. To Christy Lawrence, who helps us reach across the universe to find amazing guests. I'm going to end the metaphor right now. And to all of you who listened in. If you like the podcast, please share it, download it. We'd love you also to visit thecultureworks.com for some free resources to help you and your team thrive. Yeah,
and I'm going to be brutally honest. I think Brent and Christy are the best in as you would say, the universe. Yeah. And we also love to speak to audiences around the world, virtually or in person, on the topics of culture, teamwork, resilience, mental health. Give us a call. We'd love to speak to you and your team at your next event. Well, Adrian, it wraps up another really interesting conversation. Really appreciate Jerry Colonna and his work in Reboot and now his new book, Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong. I always give you the last word, Adrian, so take us home.
Well, thanks, everybody. Whose am I, says Jerry. Well, we are yours. We this is a labor of love for us, and we hope that you appreciate some of these thoughts that we bring you. And these guests. And so until next time, we wish you the best of mental health.